Welcome from around the country to today's seminar. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet today, and I pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. And we recognize their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. So today with us here is Pia from Tübingen, talking about couple norms from a life course perspective, and Janine is gonna introduce her.
Thanks, Barbara. Yeah, so you can see the title of Pia's presentation up there. So Pia is the head of Department of Sociology at the University of Tübingen in Germany, and she's been visiting the UQ node of the Life Course Centre since January, and she's due to head back just around Easter time. So it's been really good to have her here and joining in Life Course Centre events here, particularly in my team. Pia has a PhD in social policy from the London School of Economics, and a lot of her work has engaged with policy of various kinds, and so I think she's been a really good fit for some of the work that we're doing in the Life Course Centre, bringing both that kind of academic perspective, but also experience about, engaging with policymakers and how to translate to policymakers. Her research overlaps with a lot of what we're doing in the Life Course Centre, not just here at UQ, but more broadly. And her topics are really around gender and social inequalities in employment, family and work. But as I look through her CV and talk to her, she's done work on daycare quality, early childhood education and care, work around gender ideology and attitudes, which she's talking a bit about today, earnings, immigration, parental leave policies, and relationship satisfaction. And so there's been a lot of points of overlap, I think, not just with my team, but also more broadly across the Life Course. And yeah, I was also impressed with the amount of policy reports and engagement she's done with audiences outside academia. So that, of course, also fits very well from a Life Course Centre point of view, where we try to also make sure our results are translated out into the broader public. So yeah, I'll hand over to Pia, but it's been great to have you here, Pia. And we hope that you can visit again at some point in the future and maybe visit some of the other nodes when you come back. So I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Janine. Thanks you for the lovely introduction. Before I start my presentation, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet today, and pay my respect to the ancestors and their descendants. And so, as Janine said, I have done a lot of policy work, but actually today I will present the outcomes of one of the projects that I had over the past few years, which actually mostly looks at belief changes over the life course, which is probably the project that has the least to do with policy that I've ever worked on. But I still hope it's interesting for the Life Course Centre, because it really tries to use the Life Course perspective to study beliefs. And specifically here, we are looking at beliefs around relationships. And we study how they develop across different relationship formation and dissolution experiences that people have and encounter very frequently in several Eastern and Western European countries. And this is joint work with one of my postdocs, Marie-Fleur Philipp. So, and the background of this is really that, as you all know, the institution of marriage has lost some of its relevance. So we all know this big literature on the second demographic transition happening in many Western countries. At the same time, we also know individualization trends that we can see. And as a result, often the diagnosis was that, well, as a result of these trends or changes in values towards individualization, then there is a deinstitutionalization of marriage, for instance, showing in more liberal attitudes towards non-marital sex, but or non-marital cohabitation, and also a greater acceptance of divorce. However, then if you look at this empirically, a lot of just cross-sectional studies across countries really have found that it's a partial deinstitutionalization, because actually marriage remains quite widespread and quite also in terms of in terms of importance, it's still valued quite a lot, surprisingly, given these other trends of acceptance of alternative types of relationships. And going hand in hand with that, there has been now in the recent years a growing literature on the couple norm. So basically arguing, also based on qualitative sociological studies, that the couple is the privileged normative form of intimate life, and especially the committed long-term couple relationship. And this is clear. There is a bit of quantitative evidence that it is preferred over singlehood, and that whenever we find in some countries an increase in singles is mostly due to structural factors. So starting off from that, there has been, of course, some literature showing general changes in beliefs around relationships, acceptance of different family forms, of gender ideologies, and also marriage, just across time, usually across cohorts. And these studies really have focused on cohort replacement as a mechanism, kind of looking as if subsequent cohorts are becoming more liberal, more accepting of different alternative relationship forms. Or they have looked at specific period effects, so whether specific policies, for instance, have changed some of the beliefs. Now, what has been looked at a lot less is whether actually whether and how these beliefs change over the life course. So this is what this project was about. And I mean, we did start off with gender beliefs, and we've written a few papers also about that, but there is already a much bigger literature on gender beliefs and changes across different life course transitions. And we then thought, no, there's really a gap here. There's not very much research at all on partnership and marriage beliefs. And from a life course perspective, so that's what we wanted to do. And here we are able to look at these changes within persons over the life course in 7 European countries. And we basically argue that because some studies have shown that actually cohort replacement effects are slowing down. So generally changes over cohorts are weakening. Perhaps then it's increasingly important to really also understand these changes over the life course. And conceptually, I mean, what we will be looking at is on the one hand, factual beliefs. So what individuals assume is true regarding a partnership. So here we will be particularly looking at what are the benefits people expect from being in a relationship, and what are the perhaps negative fears they have, kind of restrictions they expect of being in a relationship, stressors. So these would refer to factual beliefs. And then we also look at normative beliefs about what these people believe, how then in particular marital partnership or marriage should be. So this refers to more how they evaluate marriage, both several dimensions that we will look at. And I'll say more about that in a moment. Our whole perspective really starts out with a relatively broad life course perspectives that probably many of you are familiar with. And we generally assume that the past and anticipated future affect the present relationship beliefs that people hold. And importantly, we then try to integrate the concept of chrononormativity, which is basically a concept that was developed from queer studies, and which suggests that there is still a relatively strong standardized life cycle ideal of how different relationship and also labor market transitions have to education transitions and so on. So that these transitions are still idealized as coming into a certain order, and then people still think they aspire to this sort of standardized life cycle, even though we do see empirically more and more deviations from it. There is still this idea in people's head, at least when they're young, when they start off, for instance, in having their first relationships. And so what we think might be one of the important driving factors of partnership and marriage belief change over the life course is that as individuals get closer to experiencing relationships that conform with standardized life cycle ideals, then they actually become more and more positive about these potential next relationship transitions happening. So the potential next steps, of course, they also take into account any new experiences they have in their new relationships, and and then also adjust their negative beliefs downwards, so to speak. And then the second important mechanism are cognitive dissonances. So we, at the same time as you transition through the life course, you enter a relationship, and especially when you then leave relationships again, when they dissolve, we would assume that people also try to avoid any inconsistencies in their beliefs that basically are relatively positive about relationships and also about marriage in many contexts. Then they need to somehow cope with that and reduce any inconsistencies with their current relationship status, which might be single or separated. And then they would kind of adjust their partnership and marriage beliefs downwards again, especially after union dissolution. But some of this adjustment might also happen to people, especially in relatively liberal countries, where they actually don't embrace marriage as such from the start, but rather there is a norm around marriage, and they do in the end enter marriage, but then adjust their beliefs around marriage only afterwards. So more concretely, let's look at specific relationship formation transitions that we will look at. So we'll first start off with entry into living apart together relationships and into cohabitation. And we would generally assume that as people experience their first relationships and also their first cohabitation, they would become more positive about the benefits of relationships and less negative about any fears or restrictions they think relationships come along with. And we also, on the whole, we would expect these sorts of earlier relationships to not yet be very closely related to marriage in most Western and Eastern European countries, where marriage is not such a strong norm anymore. However, we do expect that especially more religious Eastern European countries, in particular Poland is what we will be looking at, we would expect that the approval of marriage already rises with entry into cohabitation, because cohabitation is really strongly assumed to lead into marriage. And then in entry into marriage, here we actually expect very few changes in general positive or negative partnership beliefs, because marriage is usually succeeding cohabitation. So the actual relationship status does not change very much. It's more the legal status that changes. But also anything, people might associate it more with more positive status related partnership beliefs. So they expect more financial benefits, for instance. At the same time, after entry into marriage, they might actually start rejecting long-term non-marital cohabitation slightly more to actually justify why they entered marriage themselves. And also, generally, we expect greater approval of marriage being for a lifetime, and also marriage as an institution per se. Here again, in these sorts of marriage belief adjustments, we expect smaller changes in the more religious Eastern European countries, because the marriage norm is so prevalent there. For dissolution transitions, we generally expect, so for the relationship dissolutions as well as for cohabitation dissolutions, to kind of reverse the changes that we've seen with the entries. So we expect less positive and more negative partnership beliefs. But then also with the dissolution of cohabitation, we would expect, especially in the more religious Eastern European countries, where cohabitation is clearly still linked with the expectation of marriage, we would expect then people to reduce their potential cognitive dissonances, to also be more critical about the marriage as an institution or the approval they have for marriage. after the first marriage dissolution, so a divorce essentially, we would generally also expect people to adjust their partnership beliefs downwards and generally develop more critical beliefs regarding marriage in all dimensions. And however, we expect that more strongly so in the more religious Eastern European countries, where kind of experiencing a divorce yourself would really be a much more critical event than in the other countries where it's more accepted. The data and methods we use here are two different kinds of data sets. So on the one hand, we use the German family panel PERFAM, which it's a longitudinal panel. It ran from 2008 to 2021. So it had 13 waves. And the big advantage of this data set is that we have we can observe these beliefs every other year, and we observe people for up to 13 years. So we can see a lot of these people transitioning through several of these relationship changes. And we see a sample of about 39,500 observations nested in 9,300 respondents. And the respondents are aged anything between 18 and 50 years. And secondly, we complement that this more detailed analysis that we can do with the German data. We complement it with the generations and gender survey program from round one for those countries where we actually have two waves at least. And these waves usually took place between 2004 and 2015. And of course, the generation and gender survey did have some more European countries. However, the problem with a lot of them was that their relationship histories were not sufficiently good for our purposes, or they did not ask the marriage beliefs or not in the same way. Actually, Australia was included as well, and we had included it in some first analysis, but all the questions were on the beliefs were asked on a different scale, so we had to exclude them, Australia, in the end. So we will look at three country clusters. In particular, we will look at Western Europe, which comprises Austria, France, and Germany. More secularized Eastern European countries, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Bulgaria. And then as just one country case for more religious Eastern Europe, Poland. And I'll say more about the country clusters in a second, but the sample basically consists of 76,000 observations of 38,000 respondents. Again, covering age 18 to 65 roughly. And we use fixed effects panel regressions and basically to model within person change as people undergo these relationship transitions and how they then relate to changes in their beliefs to control for time constant heterogeneity. But then in addition, we also use entropy balancing. It's a statistical weighting technique to explore some of the relevance of those people who select into marriage and then also whose cohabitation and marriages dissolve, that they are actually a selected group of people. So to explore to what extent that changes some of the relationships. And to just briefly explain why we clustered the countries in the way we did. So we basically looked at the progression of the second demographic transition. So some indicators based on age at first marriage, cohabitation and divorce rates, and extramarital birth rates. And based on these, we then distinguished between Western European countries and more secular Eastern European countries, which, however, both types of countries show high progression in terms of the second demographic transition, whereas more secular Eastern European countries also, of course, with some variation. So Bulgaria slightly less than, and Hungary also slightly less than the Czech Republic, for instance. But they are still quite different to Poland, which has a much slower progression in this STT. And importantly, religiosity varies a lot between Poland and the other Eastern European countries. And so these were our main ways of distinguishing. And in terms of policy incentives, actually for marriage, all these countries have some sort of policy incentive for marriage. It varies a bit, France probably to the least extent, but there are not such large policy differences. How do we measure partnership beliefs? Here we have these only in the German data set PERFAM, and we basically are constructed 3 factors using factor analysis. One for positive emotion-related beliefs, so the kind of support people expect from their partner to get affection and feeling of security and so on. Then a second factor that related more to status and financial advantages in a relationship, and then a third factor on different kinds of negative beliefs, like having stress, being bored, but also the partner not being accepted by the family. And these were always measured on a scale from 1 to 5, to what extent people expected this in a partnership. Then marriage beliefs, here you can see both in PERFAM and in the GGS, non-marital cohabitation was covered by 1 item each. Then we also in PERFAM had non-marital childbearing, and marriage as a lifetime relationship was also covered in both relationships. And finally, we had in the GGS also 1 item about marriage being an outdated institution. And on the whole, this is measured on a scale from 1 to 5, and we recoded all of these items in a way that higher values indicate more liberal or more or less traditional or less conservative beliefs. So they are set standardized for all the graphs that I will show you, so that all the changes can be interpreted as percentages of standard deviations. And importantly, so they do not correlate very strongly among each other for the most part. So there is a bit of a literature showing that marriage beliefs are multidimensional, and that's also what we find. Therefore, we treat them as separate items. And in terms of our independent variables relating to relationship transitions, we really measure entry into up to the first, second, third, and fourth lat relationship, and any higher order relationships we just control for because they're not enough. We can observe, and then same for cohabitation, first and second, and then higher order cohabitation. And then we focus on entry into first marriage because we can see relatively few second marriages. And basically, then we also distinguish these orders to explore whether it matters. On the whole, we actually find there are not such big differences between the order of different relationships. And the control variables, so we do that for entry and dissolution separately. So we have them as separate variables, and we control in all our variables for relationship duration, and for entry into parenthood, and age squared, because there is a nonlinear relationship. And we also did some additional tests with cohabitation duration and marriage duration to see if some of the effects that we find, or the changes in over the life course, whether they reverse as relationships go on. And we find very little reversal per se if people don't undergo other transitions. So to start off with, I just want to show you some age trends in partnership beliefs in Germany. So, I mean, just to say, generally, people hold quite favorable views of living in a couple in terms of the emotional benefits, and they have also relatively few fears about negative relationships, but we can also see some quite interesting changes over the life course. So here you can see that actually the age trends, so the brown line or olive green line would be the positive benefits people expect in terms of affection and support. And here you can see a bit of a zigzag line, but then they do on the whole increase a little bit until people are about 35 or 40, and then they generally decrease over the life course until age 50. And whereas status related or financial benefits of relationships are particularly rising once people get into the marriage age. So here we see during young adulthood, they are increasingly expecting this. And then once people are at the age when they got married, that it's pretty much stable. And finally, for negative expectations about relationships, we can just see a continuous decline over the life course. Now, in terms of marriage beliefs, again, this is for Germany, because here we can also see people much longer, over a longer period of their life course. Here we can see, interestingly, again, there is widespread acceptance of non-marital cohabitation and childbearing, and also the possibility of divorce in Germany. However, we do see quite a bit of change over the life course, especially for non-marital cohabitation, the green line, as you can see, which is only increases slowly until the age when actually then probably the first dissolutions of either cohabitations or marriages happen, and then the acceptance of non-marital cohabitations rises. And the blue line indicates the whether or not people believe that marriage should be a lifelong union. And again, you can see a slight increase until it gets to the marriage age, and then people believe in this much more, and that it doesn't go down. So yes, and they believe in it increasingly, and then increasingly, so liberal, higher responses mean more liberal beliefs, so then they start increasingly doubting it, so that's what we see over the life course, that really the lifelong marriage is not something that many people believe in anymore at an age past 40. And in terms of the country differences in the generations and gender survey, we can actually see the main differences. Again, there is quite high support for non-marital cohabitation, but also at the same time, still about half of the people do believe that that marriage should be a lifetime relationship. And actually, the minority only say that marriage is an outdated institution. So these are means on the scale, but still, I'm just telling you roughly what this means in terms of agreement with the statements. And on the whole, we do find that the red bars indicating the more religious Eastern Europe country case of Poland, that this country has in particular a bit more traditional or conservative marriage beliefs than the other countries, although not on marriage is an outdated institution, where actually all three country clusters still show relatively high approval of marriage. Let's now look at some of our main results for what happens as people enter the first transitions into relationships. So here the pink bars show you the entries into living apart together relationships. The gray bars show entry into cohabitation, into first cohabitation, and then the red bars entry into first marriage. And here you can see first we look at partnership beliefs. So what do people expect from relationships? And here we can see as they enter into their first LAT and cohabitation relationships, they increasingly expect positive benefits of relationships in terms of emotional support. Nothing changes in terms of status-related relationships until they get married. So only marriage has an effect on status-related beliefs, and negative beliefs generally decrease with LAT entry and cohabitation entry, but then don't change anymore with marriage. For marriage beliefs, we actually see that very little changes as people enter LAT or cohabitation, except when they enter cohabitation, they also already start believing a bit more. So a negative value here means they become more conservative, more approving of marriage as a lifelong union. So this is the kind of anticipation chrononormativity effect that we anticipated. And generally the red bars here, the downward red bars, basically suggest that entry into marriage goes along with greater rejection of non-marital cohabitation, a long-term non-marital cohabitation that should be as an alternative to marriage, basically, and also greater rejection of non-marital childbearing, and a greater rejection that a greater acceptance that marriage should be a lifelong union. Now, when we look at the same, now for the GGS, we generally also find relatively few changes with LAT and cohabitation entry. So we focus here in these results on the entry to marriage. And here you can see on the left side, Western Europe, then in the middle, the more secularized Eastern European countries, and then on the right side, Poland as our more religious Eastern European country case. And on the whole, you can see that with marriage, we find effects somewhat on some of the items looking at long-term non-marital cohabitation, and that would be the pink bar, which is mainly showing a change towards more traditional attitudes in the more secularized Eastern European countries, whereas then the gray bars indicate that people increasingly believe in marriage as a lifetime relationship. And that's the case both in Western Europe and more secularized Eastern Europe. And whereas in all three country clusters, people increasingly believe that marriage is not an outdated institution. So with the brown bars indicate that. And interestingly here, we find weaker traditionalizing marriage effects in these more religious Eastern European countries. So, and that's also what we expected. Then in terms of now we move on to dissolutions, kind of asking ourselves, okay, does some of these changes, especially with marriage, reverse again as people dissolve their relationships? And here it's quite interesting that when we look at partnership beliefs, again in Germany, that we find actually that dissolutions from lat relationships or from cohabitation, they generally don't change positive relationship beliefs. So people are still equally positive about the benefits from couple relationships per se, but they do increase their negative beliefs. So for what stressors can go along with being in a relationship. And in terms of marriage, we also so marriage dissolution here, the red bar, we also find that it simply increases the negative beliefs, at least significantly. It does also reduce some of the positive beliefs, but these are not significant. Then for our marriage beliefs, we generally find that no changes after dissolutions from lat or cohabitation, which is as we would expect it. But once people experience divorce, they actually become much more liberal on non-marital cohabitation, as well as on marriage being a lifelong union. So they don't believe in that anymore to the same extent. And here the changes are big. So just to alert you, so these are about 60% of a standard deviation. And this is a really quite large change. And here also 40% of a standard deviation, which I would classify as quite large. And then now looking at the marriage dissolution in the Generations and Gender Survey, here we also find that actually across the board on nearly all items, in all country clusters, we do find these the liberalizing changes as people experience their divorce, the first divorce. However, I just want to highlight that there are a few differences. So we do find that in particular here slightly stronger effects of this dissolution on the liberalization of long-term non-marital cohabitation in the Western European countries than in the other clusters. And interestingly, then we generally find the weaker liberalizing divorce effects on marriage as an outdated institution, or also the lifetime relationship. So these sorts of the brown and the gray bars show weaker effects in the religious Eastern European countries, which is opposite to what we expected. We expected stronger effects. And interestingly, then these effects actually become stronger once you account for selection into divorce. So once we apply entropy balancing, so statistical weighting to adjust for the selectiveness of the sample based on the observed characteristics, we actually see that these effects equalize pretty much with the other country clusters and are not statistically significant anymore. So let me summarize some of the findings with respect to our hypotheses. So on the whole, lat living apart together, entry into lat relationships go hand in hand with more positive emotional and less negative beliefs. And interestingly, that same happens with entry into cohabitation. But both then, once these lat relationships dissolve again, or also once the first cohabitation breaks apart, people are more negative about their relationships, expectations, but they don't lose their positive images of being in a couple. So that is quite interesting, we think, and we believe that might be due to this relatively persistent couple norm, and might also contribute to that because people don't actually question living in a couple per se as the ideal. They are still striving towards. Then for the differences in marriage belief adaptations after cohabitation, we did find greater approval of marriage after already entry into cohabitation in more religious Eastern European countries. That's what we expected. And also greater rejection of marriage once cohabitation dissolves in more religious Eastern European countries. So that's because I guess cohabitation is much more closely linked to marriage in Poland than in the other countries we have in our sample. And then for marriage, we find that there is, with entry into marriage, people become much more positive in terms of only their status or finance-related beliefs, and nothing else really changes in what they expect from a relationship. And they generally become more approving of marriage in all our country clusters, but less so in religious Eastern European countries, which might be simply due to marriage being the norm anyway. And then in terms of the first divorce, so marriage dissolution experiences, here we see clearly more negative partnership beliefs, and also stronger rejection of marriage on all our dimensions, basically. However, we see less of that change in the religious Eastern European country, Poland, which we think is really driven by selection into divorce, because these effects disappear once we account for the selectiveness of the sample who divorces. Okay, whereas I should say all the other tests with the statistical weighting and entropy balancing did not change any of the other associations with changes over the life course. So that is so all the other results pretty much hold. Yes, so what are the implications? I want to briefly discuss those. So what do we take away from this? We think we have shown quite strong descriptive evidence that really these sorts of relationship and marriage beliefs change over the life course quite substantially. And we think that might reflect, on the one hand, a strong couple norm. So people are influenced, of course, by the significant others and fulfill normative expectations of this standardized life course and chrononormativity. But at the same time, of course, they also reproduce this couple norm through their own actions and belief adaptations. We think what is interesting to connect, we found these results in different studies, but in the end, to connect them a little bit, is that we find large increases in approval of marriage with marriage entry, but that really largely reverses again for those people who divorce. Especially in terms of kind of beliefs regarding long-term non-marital cohabitation, and also about beliefs regarding divorce. So kind of marriage being not a lifetime relationship necessarily. But interestingly, we don't find this complete reversal for marriage as an institution per se. So for that item, we really find the changes with marriage entry are much bigger than the kind of opposite changes we see after people experience divorce. So to us, that suggests or gives a bit of an underlying pattern, which seems to suggest that really marriage remains important as an institution to many people across these European societies. But it is increasingly, of course, seen as a temporary institution, that it might not be for a lifetime. But still, people think it's important to apparently enter it at least once. Then I mean, I would also want to say, I showed you that these changes are really largely similar across most countries, except for the differences with Poland. And we also tested for differences across, like between men and women and across socioeconomic status groups by education, for instance, and we find hardly any differences. So these sorts of changes are really very uniform across the life course. And I think that also suggests it's important to kind of take these changes into account, and because especially as we see slowing cohort change from one cohort to the next in more recent studies on these sorts of beliefs. Finally, I think at the individual level, I would also like to stress these sorts of beliefs are relevant moderators of the well-being outcomes of when people experience these relationship transitions. So especially for divorce, there is some literature that divorce can have longer term negative effects on individual subjective well-being and also depressive symptoms. And also in one of our papers, other papers, we show that actually this is much more relevant for people who believe in marriage as being a lifetime relationships, and who do not give up that belief. So who do not adapt their beliefs as they undergo divorce. Because for those who do adapt and just become more liberal in terms of their beliefs, the effects on their depressive symptoms, for instance, are much less severe. Yes, so I would like to thank everyone for their attention, and I look forward to any questions. I briefly want to acknowledge the funding we got for this project from the German Research Foundations. And of course, if anyone's interested in papers or has more questions, I'm always happy to also answer them via email after the talk.
So you use these country clusters basically as a proxy for how religious or how secular a community is, right? But is there a possibility to get at that a bit more directly? I could imagine that maybe urban Poland versus rural Hungary might not be that different anymore. Do you have a measure of religious beliefs on a smaller geographic level so that you could compare more other clusters rather than country borders?
Yes, I think that's a very interesting idea. I mean, we do have religious beliefs in the Generations and Gender Survey, also for the individuals. So I guess we could try and get to clusters. I think we don't really have any regional indicators in the Generations and Gender Survey. So we do have urban rural probably as a rough distinction, but we don't know anything about, subnational, regional identifiers so that we could really analyze it at a subnational level, unfortunately.
Okay. But maybe even at the individual level. I mean, then it doesn't really reflect norms of the community anymore, but norms of the person. But maybe that is also an interesting dimension.
Yes, so we have done some of this, some of the analysis for whether people, what sort of beliefs they hold, but also whether they are more or less religious. And yes, so we do find that that is a relevant distinguishing factor. Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you.
More of a comment. I'm just reflecting on what do people mean by marriage? And in Australia, we know that people are getting married later. I'm sure this is happening in other countries as well. And also they're more likely to do, it's not a religious service, it's more likely to be a civil service. So there's lots of changes in some aspects of marriage, and yet people still believe, I think, as you've shown, in marriage and partnership. So I'm just kind of reflecting that, yes, it's probably not too surprising, but I think there have been other changes in how people think about what marriage is and what it means, as reflected in the ways in which they get married and the timing of it and so on.
Yes, I mean, I totally agree. So there is a bit of qualitative research from different countries showing that marriage, depending a bit on the regulations around marriage in the specific country, marriage, of course, has moved to having a lot of legal implications. And that's also one big reason why people enter marriage. But at the same time, there is surprisingly, even in countries where the legal implications are quite important, even there, many people, based on qualitative studies, suggest marriage is also a romantic ideal. So it's kind of, yes, I think the legal implications change and people are much more and more aware of them. But at the same time, some qualitative studies would suggest it's still accompanied by also romantic beliefs around marriage. So I would agree, of course, and I mean, we should try to look at this in the very beginning of the project a bit more. What does this mean in every single country? How do they differ? But with our data, we just couldn't really get to that very well. And all countries had quite similar legal, like marriage having similar advantages in terms of legal rights people get through marriage. So we didn't really have that much variation across this. But I fully agree that would be interesting to look at further. I just thought with our data, I think we
No.
can.
You really need qualitative data. Sorry, Barbara, just one follow-up. I mean, I was very interested in the fact that you didn't find any gender differences either, because the other thing we know in Australia is that women are more likely to initiate divorce, and I think that's been found in the US and probably other countries as
Yes.
well. And then after divorce or separation, men repartner more quickly than women do. So there do seem to be gender differences around, what they get out of marriage and then how they respond to it when it, goes badly. So it's really interesting that you don't find any gender differences in
So
these
I think the
results.
only thing we find sometimes on some items, in a few transition cases, we find men adapt more strongly. So it seems to be that then, and that's not so surprising because women on the whole, at least in many of our countries, hold a bit more liberal attitudes towards marriage. So men have more conservative and then attitudes, and then they adapt more, especially as they experience divorce. But other than that, really, on the whole, all the patterns were very similar across men and women.
Mm,
We do find that these gender differences, for instance, we do find they matter very much when it comes to marriage beliefs being a moderator of how much depressive symptoms people experience after they divorce. So here, this is really important for men. It's much less important for women because of what you say, that actually women initiate divorce more often and they adjust their expectations and also they show depressive symptoms also already before they actually separate. So,
mm,
which I think goes along with the initiation process and not being satisfied in the relationship. And therefore, then their beliefs actually, they adjust their beliefs also already before they start the dissolution process, basically, at least before we can see it.
mm,
And therefore, all this happens earlier for women, whereas men really seem to be hit much harder than when it happens. And then for them, adjusting beliefs is much more of a moderator.
mm.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Pia. I just wonder, do you see the transitions have like a time, how long it takes you see those transitions? Do you see immediately in the next wave, or is actually gradually over waves you see those transitions happen of this belief change?
Yeah, so I mean, what we can only measure is whether these, we have beliefs are measured every other year. So we only have these 2 year time gaps basically, and then we can see what sort of transitions happened in between these 2 years. Um, and also we, of course, based on the retrospective histories, we can really account for every single transition people had, also if they had multiple relationships and so on. And I mean, what we do see is when we then, for instance, we use also models as robustness checks, so where we really look at only those people, for instance, who entered cohabitation. What happens then after they entered cohabitation? In subsequent years after the entry, do their attitudes basically change the same way? Do they continue to change slightly, or do they not? Is it basically then once they transitioned, it's over? And for the most part, that's what we find. So also transition into marriage, is there continuous development? No. Actually, for the most part, we really see that once these transitions are completed, at least how we can measure them in this 2-year time frame, we don't see any further change that seems to be coming with further relationship duration and so on.
Thank you.
Something occurred to me when Janine said, what is it that people actually believe in when they say they believe in marriage? So anecdotally or spontaneously, I would think that marriage has probably changed from being this sacrosanct religious God has brought us together thing, but a lot of people do believe that it's the ideal situation to bring up children. Do you see a difference between people who do divorce before or after having children, or with or without children?
So we checked that. We also expected that, and we also wanted to look at this, but unfortunately, largely we can't, because actually in Germany, nearly all divorces include children. So there are, I think, because basically having children is the reason to get married. So there is people would not get married if they were not planning to or already having children, because the legal implications only of marriage, the advantages largely occur when you have children. And then the same actually in many of the GGS countries, there is really marriage and parenthood, they go so closely together that only in the very, like in Poland, we can look at this sort of thing, because there really people marry much before they actually have children. And also many people marry and never go on to have children. Whereas in the other, so in Western Europe, definitely we don't see that. And in Eastern Europe, not even in most of the more secularized Eastern European countries, there are simply not enough married couples without children in our sample. What we do see, we do distinguish for cohabitation. So especially in the Western European and Eastern secularized countries, we can distinguish between cohabiting couples with and without children, whether then dissolution matters and has different effects, and there we don't find that. So there we did always check also for interactions with having children or not, and we don't find any effects. We also, interestingly, perhaps especially for people who study the transition to parenthood, it might be interesting, we don't find any effects of transitioning to parenthood on any of these beliefs, basically.
Oh, okay. Well, that is very interesting. Can I just ask another thing? It's not really directly related, but when you see the effects of dissolution, and then particularly men repartner relatively quickly, can you distinguish between the effect of entering a new cohabitation relationship versus exiting the marriage?
Yeah, so we basically each single transition is coded as experiencing the transition or not,
Yeah.
not as so we don't just measure whether or not they are in a relationship, but we measure whether they at the same time had an exit from a marriage in what you described and had an entry into a new cohabiting relationship, for instance. Then they would have a one on both, and we would see the results of both. And I mean, our samples are big. So I think that's also perhaps that it can be a concern. I can see that. But on the whole, I don't have the table here with me. But on the whole, I mean, we really see many 100 transitions of all of our different types of transitions in each single country. So I think on the whole, we are relatively safe that there is, and we did additional checks for multicollinearity and so on by restricting people to specific samples and so on. And we don't find any differences in the results. So I think our measures kind of are as good as they can get. We really check that a lot.